What was the first disease conquered by human beings?
Smallpox was the first disease eradicated by medicine. Caused by a virus spread from person to person through the air. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases and there was no treatment for it. Before the discovery of the New World, smallpox epidemics swept across Africa, Asia, and Europe, leaving victims scarred and slash or blind, and killing countless millions. When explorers set out to find new trade routes and landed in North and South America, they brought the disease with them, infecting the indigenous peoples. But once a person had the disease, he or she would not contract it again. This and other observations led British physician Edward Jenner, 1749 to 1823, to develop a successful vaccine against the disease. Prior to the vaccine, the only preventive method was inoculation of the disease itself, which sometimes led to further spread of the disease. For example, in 1777 American General George Washington, 1732 to 1799, obtained congressional approval to inoculate the entire Continental Army against smallpox, but the results were mixed. After its discovery in 1798, the use of Jenner's vaccine quickly spread. The first vaccine given in the United States was in 1799 by a Harvard physician. During the 1800s, many countries passed laws requiring vaccination. Improvements in the vaccine resulted in the elimination of smallpox from Europe and North America by the 1940s. When the World Health Organization, WHO, was created by the United Nations in 1946. One of its aims was to reduce the instances of smallpox around the world. Immunization programs brought this about. The last natural occurrence of the disease was reported in October 1977 in Somalia, Africa. When no further cases were documented within the next 2 years, the disease was considered eradicated.
What is behaviorism?
Behaviorism is a school of psychology that attempts to explain human behavior in terms of responses to environmental stimuli, influenced by the conditioned reflex demonstrated by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. 1849 to 1936, American psychologist John Broadus Watson, 1878 to 1958, of Johns Hopkins University, codified and popularized the theory, which discards introspection and consciousness as influences on human behavior. Behaviorism was further studied by another American psychologist and Harvard professor B. F. Skinner. 1904 to 1990, Skinner focused his work on patterns of responses to observable stimuli versus unobservable stimuli such as introspection and conscience, and external rewards. Applied to human learning, Skinner's theories on behaviorism affected educational methods, which tangibly reward good behavior.
Why was Oliver Cromwell important to British history?
English soldier and statesman Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658. Was a key player in a chain of events that shaped modern British government. The events began when Charles I, 1600 to 1649, House of Stuart, ascended the throne in 1625 and shortly thereafter married a French Catholic princess, immediately raising the ire of his Protestant subjects. This was not the end of England's problems with King Charles. After repeated struggles with the primarily Puritan Parliament, Charles dismissed the legislative body in 1629 and went on to rule without it for 11 years. During this period, religious and civil liberties were seriously diminished, and political and religious strife prevailed. Fearing the king's growing power, Parliament moved to raise an army. And soon civil war broke out, 1642 to 48. Like the French Revolution, 1789 to 99 fought 150 years later. The struggle in England was largely one between a king who claimed to rule by divine right and a government body, in this case Parliament, that claimed the right to govern the nation in behalf of the people. Enter military leader Oliver Cromwell, after 2 years of indecisive battles in the English Civil War. Cromwell led his parliamentary army troops to victories at Marston Moor, 1644, and Naseby, 1645, which resulted in Charles's surrender. But when Charles escaped his captors in 1647, the fighting was briefly renewed. It was ended once and for all in 1648, when the king was tried the following year. Cromwell was among those leading the charge to have Charles executed. The king's opponents had their way and, having abolished the monarchy, soon established the Commonwealth of England, installing Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. Though Cromwell endeavoured to bring religious tolerance to England and was somewhat successful in setting up a quasi-democratic government, he declined to take the title of king in 1657. His leadership was constantly challenged by those who wished to restore the Stuart monarchy. When Cromwell died in 1658, he was succeeded by his son, Richard, 1626 to 1712. Whose talents were not up to the challenges put to the Lord Protector. The movement to restore the monarchy, particularly the Stuart line, gained impetus, and Richard Cromwell was soon dismissed and went to live outside of England for the next 20 years. Charles II, 1630 to 1685, the son of Charles I, ascended the throne in 1660. Beginning the 8-year period known as the Restoration. Both Charles and his brother, James II, 1633 to 1701, who succeeded him in 1685, worked to reassert the absolutism of the Stuart monarchy. But both kings butted heads with Parliament, particularly when it came to financial matters. Finally in 1688, James II was deposed in the so-called Glorious Revolution. William III, 1650 to 1702, grandson of Charles I, and his wife, Queen Mary II. 1662–1694, daughter of James II, were placed on the throne the following year. Though the House of Stuart remained in power, there was an important hitch. Parliament compelled William and Mary to accept the Bill of Rights, of 1689, which asserted that the Crown no longer had absolute power in England and that it must rule responsibly through the nation's representatives sitting in Parliament. Thus, the English Civil War, also called the Protestant Revolution, and the influence of Oliver Cromwell and other parliamentarians laid the foundation for England's constitutional monarchy.
Who were the Know-Nothings?
The Know-Nothings were members of A.U.'s political movement during the mid-1800s, Americans who feared the foreign influence of immigrants. There was an influx of new arrivals in the 1840s, banded together, sometimes in secret societies, in order to uphold what they believed to be the American view. When people who were thought to be members of these groups were asked about their views and activities, the typical response was, "I don't know," which gave the movement its name. The Know-Nothings worked to elect only Native Americans, U.S. born citizens, to political office. And they advocated the requirement for citizenship be 25 years of residence in the United States. Since many immigrants came from European countries and were Roman Catholics, the Know-Nothings also opposed the Catholic Church. In 1843, Know-Nothings formed the American Republican Party. By 1854 they had allied themselves with factions within the Whig Party and in the state elections held that year. Know-Nothings swept the vote in Massachusetts and Delaware, nearly carried New York and Pennsylvania, and pulled substantial votes in the South. The following year, the Know-Nothings dropped much of their secrecy and became known simply as the American Party. It was the issue of slavery that finally split the party in the national election of 1856. And the group dissolved after that. Anti-slavery members of the American Party joined the newly formed Republican Party.
How long did people believe in the theory of spontaneous generation?
Spontaneous generation, the theory that living things can develop from non-living things, originated in prehistoric times and held sway throughout the Middle Ages, 500–1350. One of the first scientists to test this theory was Italian physician Francesco Redi, 1626–1697. In 1668 Redi demonstrated that as long as meat was covered, maggots would not form on it. When left uncovered, flies would land on the meat, lay eggs, and thus, produce maggots. Despite Redi's findings, the theory of spontaneous generation continued to influence scientists and physicians for centuries. It was ultimately discredited by the successive experiments of Dutch naturalist Antony van Leeuwenhoek. 1632 to 1723, French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895. And German physician and pioneer bacteriologist Robert Koch, 1843 to 1910, who together proved that bacteria cause infectious diseases.
What was the Peloponnesian War?
It was the war fought between the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta between 431 and 404 B. C. It left Athens ruined. The beginning of the war signaled the end of the Golden Age of Greece. As the city-states, which were self-ruling regions made up of a city and the surrounding territory, developed, an intense rivalry grew between Athens and Sparta. The Spartans recruited allies into the Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnese Peninsula forms the southern part of mainland Greece. And together they attacked the Athenian Empire, which had been gaining in power. The war consisted of 3 stages. The first was the Archidamean War, 431 to 421 BC. Named for Archidamus, the Spartan king who led the unsuccessful attacks on fortified Athens. In 421 the so-called Peace of Nicias, 421 to 413 BC. began, which was negotiated by Athenian politician Nicias. But this truce was broken when an Athenian commander promoted counterattacks on Athens's aggressors in 418 and 415 BC. The attacks on the Peloponnesian League were unsuccessful. And so the Ionian War broke out, 413 to 404 BC. After years of fighting, the Ionian War finally ended in victory for Sparta, after the Peloponnesian League had not only gained the support of Persia to defeat Athens but had successfully encouraged Athens's own subjects to revolt. Athens surrendered to Sparta, ending the Peloponnesian War.
What was the impact of network television?
The big 3 networks rose to power in the 1950s and dominated television for the next 2 decades. During much of this period, they captured more than 90% of the total viewing audience. Americans had turned away from the radio programs and films that had diverted them in the post-war 1940s and were tuning into television the tube at an average rate of 25 hours per week, leaving little time for any other recreational pursuits. In short, television had become not only an American pastime, but an American obsession. Radio, which had given birth to television, both NBC and CBS were radio networks before they began developing TV programming, saw its revenue cut in half almost overnight. It not only lost audiences and advertisers to TV, but lost popular programs and stars as well. Radio turned its attention to an emerging new art form, rock and roll. The move was a success, as young listeners tuned in to hear the music. that was considered too raw to be included in the evening TV lineup. Film felt the effects of television as well, as audiences stayed home to be entertained. Movie makers attempted to lure audiences back into the theaters with gimmicks including 3D movies, Panavision, Cinemascope, and Circle Vision. Hollywood abandoned the Western and other B-movies in favor of big-budget blockbusters, many of which were filmed on location rather than at studios or on backlots. Studios even forbade their stars from appearing on TV, but they soon relented. Cooperation between the two industries is what saved film. Studios sold old movies to the networks for broadcast and provided production talent and facilities to television. Newspapers were least affected by the tremendous popularity of television. Since programming time was at first limited to 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., which still left time to read the paper. As soon as television expanded programming beyond that 3-hour window, however, newspapers felt the pinch more sharply in 1963, when both CBS and NBC began airing news shows. Daytime programming spelled the demise of the evening paper. While television had no impact on the number of books published, it did prompt a decrease in the number of fiction titles that were published, and a corresponding increase in the number of non-fiction titles. The upward trend of non-fiction titles is a lasting effect of television on the publishing industry. Today experts disagree over the impact of television on our lives. Some argue that increased crime is a direct outcome of television since programs show crime as an everyday event and advertisements make people more aware of what they don't have. Critics also maintain that television stimulates aggressive behavior, reinforces ethnic stereotyping, and leads to a decrease in activity and creativity. Proponents of television counter, citing increased awareness in world events, improved verbal abilities, and greater curiosity as benefits of television viewing. By the end of the 1950s, more than 50 million American families owned a television.
What was the Gang of Four?
The Gang of Four was a group within China's Communist Party that, under the leadership of Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing, 1914 to 1991, 21 years his junior, carried out its own power-hungry agenda and plotted the takeover of the government from Chairman Mao, 1893 to 1976. A former stage and movie actress, Jiang was also an astute student of politics. In the late 1960s, at which time she had been married to Mao for some 30 years, she became associated with former army commander Lin Biao, and the pair conspired to stage a coup. In 1970, at a Communist Party conference, they announced that Lin had surpassed Mao as the leader of the people. 1 year later, Lin and Jiang tried to overthrow Mao's government. Failing, Lin fled the country. His plane was later shot down, and Jiang succeeded in covering up her involvement in the affair. But she continued her subversive activities, associating with 3 other members of the Politburo. The Chief Executive and Political Committee of the Communist Party. In 1974, Mao publicly admonished his wife and her cohorts, Wang Hongwen, Yao Wenyuan, and Zhang Chunqiu, to cease their power-seeking activities. Infighting in the party had already resulted in Mao's loss of influence. 2 years later, on September 9, 1976, Mao died. The Gang of Four were arrested and thrown into prison. There they remained for years while the case against them was formulated, resulting in an indictment that consisted of 20,000 words. Finally, on November 20, 1980, the Gang of Four expanded to include 6 other conspirators, were put on trial charged with counter-revolutionary acts, including sedition and conspiracy to overthrow the government, persecution of party and state leaders, suppression of the people, and plotting to assassinate Mao. During nearly 6 weeks of testimony, Jiang's machinations were revealed to the 600 representatives who attended the trial, held in an Air Force auditorium in western Beijing. As well as to the Chinese press, foreign press was prohibited from attending. Her laundry list of malicious acts as ringleader of the Gang of Four included public humiliation and even torture of Communist Party rivals, execution of her personal enemies. Inspiring the fear of the masses, and purging the arts of anything that did not carry a revolutionary theme. Jiang, while not denying many of these acts, insisted that she had all along acted at the behest of her husband, Mao. During the explosive testimony and presentation of evidence, which included tapes and documents substantiating the state's case against Jiang, she made outbursts, was temporarily expelled from the courtroom, was dragged screaming from the courtroom twice, and even taunted her accusers into executing her, saying it would be more glorious to have my head chopped off. In the end, Jiang and 1 other conspirator were found guilty and sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. And the 8 others were also found guilty and charged with sentences ranging from 16 years to life in prison. Jiang died on May 14, 1991, in what appeared to be a suicide.
So much art is called impressionistic today. What exactly is impressionism?
The term Impressionism was derived by a rather mean-spirited art critic from the title of one of Claude Monet's 1840 to 1926 early paintings, Impression, Fog, La Havre, 1872. The French Impressionist painters were interested in the experience of the natural world and in rendering it exactly as it is seen, not fixed and frozen with an absolute perspective, but rather as constantly changing and as it is glimpsed by a moving eye. Georges Seurat, 1859–1891, and Paul Signac, 1863–1935, are also typically thought of as Impressionists. However, they are more appropriately dubbed Neo-Impressionists since they along with Camille Pissarro, 1830 to 1903, advanced the work of the original group through more scientific theories of light and color, introducing deliberate optical effects to their works. Seurat and Signac are commonly referred to as pointillists for the technique pioneered by Seurat, of using small brush strokes to create an intricate mosaic effect. The Post-Impressionists, artists representing a range of explorations but all having come out of the Impressionist movement, included both Seurat and Signac, as well as Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. 1864 to 1901, Paul Gauguin, 1848 to 1903, Vincent van Gogh, 1853 to 1890. And Paul Cézanne, 1839 to 1906, who was also associated with the original Impressionists. Together the Impressionists paved the way for the art of the 20th century. Since as a group they asserted the identity of a painting as a thing, a created object in its own right, with its own structure and its own laws beyond and different from the world of man and nature, history of modern art.
How many amendments have been made to the U.S. Constitution?
There have been 27 amendments to date. The following list gives brief summaries and the year each became part of the U.S. Constitution. First Amendment through the 10th Amendment, 1791 comprise the Bill of Rights. 11th Amendment, 1798 declares that U.S. federal courts cannot try any case brought against a state by a citizen of another state or country. 12th Amendment, 1804 revised the presidential and vice presidential election rules such that members of the Electoral College, called electors, vote for one person as president and for another as vice president. Prior to the passage of this amendment, the electors simply voted for two men. The one receiving more votes became president and the other became vice president. 13th Amendment, 1865 prohibits slavery. Along with Amendments 14 and 15, these are sometimes called the Civil War Amendments. 14th Amendment, 1868. Defines U.S. citizenship and gives all citizens equal protection under the law. This amendment made former slaves citizens of both the United States and the state where they lived. It further forbade states to deny equal rights to any person. 15th Amendment, 1870 states that the right of U.S. citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment was meant to extend suffrage to black men. 16th Amendment, 1913 authorizes a federal income tax. 17th Amendment, 1913 provides for the direct election of senators. Before this passed, state legislatures elected senators to represent them. This amendment gave that power to the people of each state. 18th Amendment, 1919 made prohibition legal. In other words, the manufacture and distribution of alcohol became illegal. 19th Amendment, 1920 grants women the right to vote. 20th Amendment, 1933 also called the Lame Duck Amendment. It changed congressional terms of office and the dates of the presidential inauguration, so that newly elected officials take office closer to election time. 21st Amendment, 1933 repealed Amendment 18 to end prohibition. 22nd Amendment, 1951 limits presidential tenure to 2 terms in office. A president can hold office for no more than 10 years, 2 years as an unelected president, and 2 terms as an elected president. 23rd Amendment, 1961 grants residents of Washington, D.C., the right to vote in presidential elections. 24th Amendment, 1964 outlaws the poll tax in all federal elections and primaries. Some states had used poll taxes as a way of keeping certain populations of voters from casting their ballots. The practice had served to disenfranchise blacks and poor people. 25th Amendment, 1967 provides for procedures to fill the vice presidency and further clarifies presidential succession rules. Upon removal, resignation, or death of the president, the vice president assumes the presidency. If a vice president is removed, resigns, or dies while in office, the president nominates a vice president who takes office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. 26th Amendment, 1971 lowers the voting age for federal and state elections to 18. 27th Amendment, 1992 prevents Congress from passing immediate salary increases for itself. It requires that salary changes passed by Congress cannot take effect until after the next congressional election. This amendment had been passed by Congress in 1788 and was then sent to the states for ratification. Since the amendment had no time limit for ratification, it became part of the Constitution in 1992. After Michigan became the 38th state to ratify it.
What were the gulags?
Gulags were prisons for political dissidents in the Soviet Union. The prisons existed from 1919 into the 1950s. Gulag is an abbreviation of the Russian name of the system. Globnye upravilnye ispravitelno trudovik lagary, which translates to Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps. The camps were first used during the collectivization of agriculture in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Under Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's 1879–1953 purges of the 1930s, anyone who posed or seemed to pose a threat to his hardline communist regime was rounded up and sent to a gulag. During World War II, 1939–45, prisoners of war were held in the gulags. And after the war, Stalin continued to use the camps to punish those who opposed him. Though exact figures are unknown, it is believed that as many as 30 million people were imprisoned in gulags. where they faced forced labor, grueling conditions, and maltreatment including starvation. Official Soviet figures place the number around 10 million. Millions are believed to have died in the gulags. After Stalin died in 1953, the system was dismantled, with some of the prisoners receiving amnesty.
What does the Declaration of Independence say?
The Declaration of Independence, adopted July 4, 1776, has long been regarded as history's most eloquent statement of the rights of the people. In it, not only did the 13 American colonies declare their freedom from Britain, they also addressed the reasons for the proclamation, naming the causes which impel them to the separation, and cited the British government's violations of individual rights, saying the history of the present King George III of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, which aimed to establish an absolute tyranny over these states. The opening paragraphs go on to state the American ideal of government, an ideal that is based on the theory of natural rights. The Declaration of Independence puts forth the fundamental principles that a government exists for the benefit of the people and that all men are created equal. As the chairman of the Second Continental Congress Committee that prepared the Declaration of Independence, it was Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, who wrote and presented the first draft to the Second Continental Congress on July 2, 1776. The passage that is most frequently quoted is this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness."
What was the Battle of Tippecanoe?
The battle near present-day Lafayette, Indiana, took place on November 7, 1811, when U.S. troops under the command of General William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, defeated the Shawnee Indians while their leader, Tecumseh, 1768 to 1813, was away. Before the November battle, the Shawnee Indians had been steadily pushed back from their ancestral lands along the Cumberland River in Kentucky. Once they settled in the Ohio River Valley, they formed a wall of resistance to further pressure. Resistance fighting began in 1763 and did not end until 30 years later. 1793, when the American forces of General Anthony Wayne, 1745 to 1796, defeated the Shawnee at Fallen Timbers in northwest Ohio. Tecumseh was 25 years old at the time of this critical defeat of his people. He became determined, despite the counsel of the tribe elders, to halt the westward movement of the Shawnee. Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, c. 1768–1834, built a settlement on Tippecanoe Creek near the Wabash River, Indiana. Called Prophetstown, it became a rallying point for those Indians who resisted displacement by colonists. Soon the Shawnee who had settled at Prophetstown were joined by bands of Wyandot, Potawatomi, Miami, and Delaware Indians. The British became aware of Tecumseh's defiance and soon supplied Prophetstown Indians with arms to use against the Americans. In 1810 the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, 1773–1841, requested a meeting with Tecumseh. But both were suspicious of each other and could reach no agreement for peace. Settlers who were aware of Tecumseh's armed resistance movement pressured President James Madison, 1751–1836, to take action, which he did, under orders from the president. Harrison set out in the fall of 1811 with a force of 1,000 men. Arriving at Tippecanoe on November 6, he met with the Indians under a flag of truce and then made camp about a mile away from Prophetstown. Tecumseh was visiting the Creek Indians in Alabama at the time, trying to rally their support in the white resistance movement. But his brother, Tenskwatawa, rallied the men at Prophetstown, and at the break of day, they attacked Harrison's camp. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued in an icy drizzle. The Indian alliance retreated, and though Harrison took heavy losses, he had managed to destroy Prophetstown. The battle undermined Tecumseh's initiative and launched the career of Harrison. In 1840, after successful military duty and service in the U.S. Congress, Harrison rode a wave of public support all the way to the White House to become the 9th president. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. John Tyler was his running mate. Eventually the Shawnee were pushed into Kansas. Tecumseh became an ally of the British in the War of 1812–14, and was killed in the fighting.
What happened to the Hindenburg?
The image of the large airship bursting into flames is familiar to many. Hindenburg, a German vessel and the largest airship ever built, exploded while it was trying to land at Lakehurst, New Jersey, at about 7:25 p.m. on May 6, 1937. Hindenburg had just completed a transatlantic flight and had dropped its mooring lines to the ground crew when the hydrogen gas that kept the airship afloat caught fire. Within 32 seconds, Hindenburg was nothing but smoldering rubble on the ground. 62 of the 97 people on board survived the crash. in addition to the 35 passengers and crew who lost their lives. One member of the American ground crew also perished. Though the cause of the fire has never been conclusively determined. It is believed that an atmospheric electrical spark not sabotage ignited hydrogen gas that was flowing from a leak. The fact that the outer cover of the tail section had been observed to flutter just seconds before the explosion lends credence to the explanation that there had been a gas leak. The crash was thoroughly documented. Though travel by airship had been going on for more than 25 years and some 50,000 passengers had been transported without a single fatality. The Hindenburg's landing in New Jersey was still an event for which many spectators turned out. Airships were a marvel of technology. And the Hindenburg in particular was worth seeing since it was the largest afloat. Even though the airship was more than 12 hours behind schedule. Due to weather over the Atlantic, the arrival was eagerly anticipated. The entire event was caught on film, and that documentary was widely shown in movie newsreels. Newspaper and radio coverage also helped link the Hindenburg and airship travel on the whole with terrifying technological disaster. The highly publicized crash effectively ended airship travel. A sister ship, the Graf Zeppelin, was en route from Rio de Janeiro back home to Germany when news of the Hindenburg disaster came in. Upon arrival, the Graf Zeppelin was grounded until the cause of the Hindenburg's crash was known. No passenger airships took flight again. 2 years later, an airplane carried its first paying passenger across the Atlantic. Today, airships, or blimps, are used by major corporations such as Goodyear during national events. Primarily sporting events. Some airships are also used for reconnaissance and patrol.
Why was Constantine I called the Great?
Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, c. 275 to 337, is credited with no less than beginning a new era in history. His father, Constantius, was ruler of the Roman Empire when he died in 306. Though Constantine was named emperor by Roman soldiers, a power struggle ensued. During a battle near Rome in 312, Constantine, who had always been sympathetic toward Christians, reportedly saw a vision of a flaming cross. He emerged from the conflict both converted and victorious. For the next 12 years, Constantine ruled the West Roman Empire while Licinius, also tolerant to Christians, ruled the East. But a struggle between the two emperors ended in death for Licinius and, beginning in 325, Constantine ruled as sole emperor. During Constantine's reign, Christians regained freedom of worship and the Christian Church became legal. In 325 he convened the Council of Nicaea, from whence came the Nicene Creed so familiar to Christians today. in moving the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, in 330. Constantine shifted the empire's focus from west to east and in so doing laid the foundation for the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Orthodox Church regards Constantine as a saint.
How did the Aztec and Inca empires compare with the Mayan?
While all were advanced civilizations that were eventually conquered by Spaniards, the Inca and Aztec cultures reached their peaks in the 15th century just before the arrival of the Europeans in the New World. The Mayan civilization reached its zenith about 500 years earlier, and was already in decline by the time of European incursion. Each group also occupied a different region of the Americas, where each carved out its own stronghold and flourished. The Aztecs settled in central Mexico, the Incas in western South America, primarily Peru, and the Mayas in the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America. There is evidence that they traded with each other as well as with American Indians to the north. The Aztecs founded their central city of Tenochtitlan, the site of Mexico City, about 1325. A poor nomadic people before their arrival in Mexico's central region. The Aztecs believed the Lake Texcoco marsh was a prophetic place to settle. Before they built it into a great city, they first had to fill in the swampy area, which they did by creating artificial islands. In the 1500s, when the Spanish first saw the remarkable city with its system of causeways, canals, bridges, and aqueducts, they called it the Venice of the New World. In addition to constructing the impressive trade and cultural center of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were farmers, astronomers, mathematicians, and historians who recorded the events of their civilization. Their religion was pantheistic, meaning they worshipped many gods. Given that, it's not surprising that when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, at first the Maya believed they were gods, or at least the heavenly hosts of their long-awaited god Quetzalcoatl, and even welcomed them with gifts. Later, the Aztec rose up against the Europeans, but under the leadership of Hernán Cortés. 1485 to 1547, the Spaniards conquered the group, claiming Mexico in August 1521. The Incas developed one of the most extensive empires in all the Americas. During the 100 years before the arrival of the Europeans, the Incas expanded their territory along the western coast of South America to include parts of present-day Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Though it was a vast region, it was nevertheless a closely knit state ruled by a powerful emperor. The government was subdivided down to the local level. But because the emperor required total obedience from his subjects, local rulers were kept in check. Like the Aztecs in Mexico, the Inca developed an infrastructure that included a network of roads, bridges, and ferries as well as irrigation systems. They, too, built impressive edifices, demonstrating their abilities as engineers. The magnificent city of Machu Picchu was modeled in clay before construction began. The Inca were also skilled craftspeople, working with gold, silver, and textiles. Like the Aztecs, the Incas worshipped many gods. And when the Spanish explorer Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475–1541, arrived in the region in 1532, he was welcomed as a god at first. However, by 1537 the Inca were brought under Spanish control.
What impact have VCRs and digital recorders had on television viewing?
Since VCRs, invented 1975, and the more recent digital recorders such as TiVo give viewers the ability to record television programs and watch them when they choose, a phenomenon known as time shifting has emerged. As Americans watch previously recorded programming, they miss primetime broadcasts. Commentators mused that Americans were losing a sense of community. Gone were the days when office workers would stand around a water cooler to chat about last night's episode of a popular program. Since these recording devices also gave viewers the ability to fast forward through commercials, a practice dubbed zapping, they posed challenges to the advertising industry.
How many immigrants arrived at Ellis Island?
More than 12 million people first entered the United States through Ellis Island. Their descendants account for an estimated 40% of the nation's current population. The majority of new arrivals were European, but immigrants also came from the West Indies, Asia, and the Middle East. More men than women arrived at the immigration depot. Originally a 3-acre landmass, the island is situated in the New York Harbor, off the southern tip of Manhattan. It was named for Samuel Ellis, a merchant and farmer who owned the island during the late 1700s. New York acquired the land, and in 1808 sold it to the federal government. The site served as a fort, and later, an arsenal. By the end of the century, record numbers of immigrants prompted the federal government to establish a bureau to process the new arrivals, the vast majority of whom entered the country at its largest port, New York City. On January 1, 1892, the federal immigration station opened on the island in the shadows of the Statue of Liberty, dedicated 1886, on nearby Bedloe Island. The Ellis Island facility, which by 1901 consisted of 35 buildings, was the country's chief immigration station. Its heaviest use was in processing the influx of immigrants who arrived between 1892 and 1924. The facility was closed on November 29, 1954, when immigration quotas had drastically reduced the number of incoming people and the mass processing center was no longer needed. On May 11, 1965, Ellis Island was designated a National Historic Site. During the 1980s it was extensively restored so that visitors to the park and museum are afforded a glimpse of what their ancestors experienced upon arriving in this new land.
How did the House of Tudor originate?
The name of a royal family that ruled England for well over a century, from 1485 to 1603, came from a Welshman, Owen Tudor, who sometime after 1422 married Catherine of Valois, 1401 to 1437, the widow of Henry V, who ruled from 1413 to 1422. The family did not come to power until Henry VII ascended the throne. Ruling from 1485 until his death in 1509, Henry VII, 1457 to 1509, ended the bitter 30-year War of the Roses, during which two noble families, the houses of Lancaster and York, had struggled against each other for control of the throne. The conflict earned its name since the badge of each house depicted a rose, one red and the other white. In taking power, Henry VII became the head of the House of Lancaster, and in 1486 he married into the House of York, thus uniting the two former enemies and founding his own Tudor dynasty. He's known as Henry Tudor.
Who are considered the founding fathers of the United States?
The term is used to refer to a number of American statesmen who were influential during the Revolutionary period of the late 1700s. Though definitions vary, most include the authors of the Declaration of Independence and the signers of the U.S. Constitution among the nation's founding fathers. Of the 56 members of the Continental Congress who signed the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776, the most well-known are John Adams, 1735 to 1826, and Samuel Adams, 1722 to 1803, of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790, of Pennsylvania, John Hancock, 1737 to 1793, of Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, of Virginia. The 39 men who signed the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787, include notable figures such as George Washington, 1732 to 1799, who would go on, of course, to become the first President of the United States. Alexander Hamilton, 1755 to 1804, who, as a former military aide to George Washington, went on to become the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and James Madison, 1751 to 1836. Who is called the father of the Constitution for his role as negotiator and recorder of debates between the delegates. At 81 years of age, Benjamin Franklin was the oldest signer of the Constitution and was among the 6 statesmen who could claim the distinction of signing both it and the Declaration of Independence. The others were George Clymer, 1739 to 1813, Robert Morris, 1734 to 1806, George Read, 1733 to 1798, Roger Sherman, 1721 to 1793, and James Wilson, 1742 to 1798. Patriots and politicians conspicuous by their absence from the Constitutional Convention of 1787 were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were performing other government duties at the time and would each go on to become U.S. President. Samuel Adams and John Jay, 1745 to 1829. Who were not appointed as state delegates but who continued in public life, holding various federal and state government offices, including governor of their states, and Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, of Virginia, who saw no need to go beyond the Articles of Confederation, 1777, to grant more power to the central government. Henry's view on this issue foreshadows the discontent that crested nearly 100 years later when 12 Southern states, including Virginia, seceded from the Union, causing the Civil War, 1861-65, to break out. Adams, Franklin, Hancock, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and Henry. These are the names that come to mind when the words Founding Fathers are uttered. Each of them had a profound impact in the political life of the United States even beyond their starring roles as patriots and leaders during the American Revolutionary era. However, it's important to note that in many texts and to many Americans, the term Founding Fathers refers only to the men who drafted the U.S. Constitution, since it is that document that continues more than 200 years after its signing to provide the solid foundation for American democratic government.
How did CNN change television news?
When Ted Turner's cable news network, CNN, went on the air June 1, 1980, it was amid a fair amount of skepticism. Some thought the maverick businessman was ill-advised to air news around the clock to cable television subscribers. History would soon prove Turner's detractors wrong. 24 hours of airtime brought CNN something other news entities didn't have the time to do: more stories and more in-depth news stories. The American public embraced the concept and soon began to rely on CNN not only to provide more information than other TV news sources, but for breaking news and up-to-the-minute updates on top stories. In 1991, during the CNN coverage of the Persian Gulf War, which CNN had more or less aired live, newspapers reported a phenomenon: Americans couldn't turn the news station off. Gone were the days of planning dinner around the evening network news or waiting until 11 p.m. to learn the latest. CNN and its sister station, Headline News Network, were news at the ready. At a time when the term global marketplace was quickly becoming part of the vocabulary of every working American, CNN was uniquely able to capitalize on the growing sensibility of a world community. In 1985, CNN International was launched as a 24-hour global news service. At first reaching only to England, By 1989 the signal was beamed via satellite to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. CNN has continued to evolve its programming to cover news in every area of endeavor with programs such as Business Day, Larry King Live, World Today, and Science and Technology Week, proving that the concept has staying power. The network, which began turning a profit after 5 years, has picked up multiple journalism awards, including the coveted Peabody Award. One of the early harbingers of CNN's success came in April 1982 when CNN won the right to be on equal footing with the major network news organizations in the White House press pool.
Did the Roman Republic precede the Roman Empire?
Yes, the Roman Republic, which for centuries afterward was considered the model form of a balanced government, was established in 509 B. C. The Roman Empire was not established until 27 BC when Augustus, also known as Octavian, 63 B.Ca.D14, became its first ruler. In brief, the development of ancient Rome is as follows. In 753 BC the city of Rome was established. Legend has it, the city was founded by brothers Romulus and Remus. Situated on wooded hills above the Tiber River, about 15 miles from the sea, Rome enjoyed the advantages of access to trade routes while having natural protection from aggressors. The city was defensible. Agriculture prospered in the area, as did other economic endeavors including manufacturing and mining. In 509 BC the Republic was established by noblemen. The government was headed by 2 elected officials who were called consuls. Since they shared power, a certain measure of balance was ensured in that either one could veto the actions of the other. And the posts were brief, each elected official served for only 1 year. These heads of state were guided by the Roman Senate, which was made up of senior statesmen. There were also assemblies in which the people had a voice. In 390 BC Rome was captured and sacked by the Gauls, a Celtic people from Western Europe, who were able to hold it for a short time. About 300 BC the Romans came into contact with the Greeks, adopting not only some of their ideas, but their mythology as well. The Greek gods and goddesses were soon given Roman names. By 275 BC Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. Their homeland stable, the Romans set their sights on overseas expansion. And between 264 and 146 BC fought the Punic Wars in order to gain territory. They conquered the Mediterranean islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, part of Gaul, much of Spain, and Carthage, in northern Africa. In the last century BC Rome entered a period that is considered the height of their civilization. But about the middle of that century, the Republic was torn by civil wars. After 20 years of fighting, the Roman Empire was formed in 27 BC when Augustus Octavian became the first emperor. While vestiges of the republic were maintained, the emperor held supreme authority, nominating the consuls and appointing senators, controlling the provinces, and heading the army. The civilian assemblies were still in place, but had for the most part lost their voice in government. The Roman Empire lasted nearly 500 years. By the 3rd century AD, Roman armies had conquered so many peoples that the empire stretched across Europe and included the entire Mediterranean coast of Africa as well as parts of the Middle East. During this time of power and expansion, trade thrived over a vast network of roads and sea routes, which extended to China, India, and Africa. Coins, made of gold, silver, copper, and bronze, were issued and controlled by the Roman government. In 395, upon the death of Emperor Theodosius the Great, 347 to 395, the Roman Empire was divided into two, East and West. In 476, after suffering a series of attacks from nomadic Germanic tribes, Rome fell.
When did Martin Luther King Jr. give his "I Have a Dream" speech?
The occasion was the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. That summer day, more than a quarter million people lobbying for congressional passage of a civil rights bill gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to hear speakers, including the charismatic and influential King, 1929 to 1968. His eloquent words define the movement and still inspire those who continue to work for reforms. Among his words were these: "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Congress did pass the Civil Rights Act, in 1964. The most comprehensive American civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction, the 12-year period that followed the Civil War. The act outlawed racial discrimination in public places, assured equal voting standards for all citizens, prohibited employer and union racial discrimination, and called for equality in education.
What was the National Bank Act?
The National Bank Act of 1863 was designed to create a national banking system, float federal war loans, and establish a national currency. Congress passed the act to help resolve the financial crisis that emerged during the early days of the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. The fight with the South was expensive, and no effective tax program had been drawn up to finance it. In December 1861, banks suspended specie payments, payments in gold or silver coins for paper currency. People could not convert banknotes into coins. The government responded by passing the Legal Tender Act, 1862, issuing $150 million in national notes called greenbacks. But banknotes, paper bills issued by state banks, accounted for most of the currency in circulation. To bring financial stability to the nation and fund the war effort, the National Bank Act of 1863 was introduced in the Senate in January of that year. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase, 1808 to 1873, aided by Senator John Sherman. 1823 to 1900, of Ohio, promoted it to the legislators. The bill was approved in the Senate by a close vote of 23 to 21. The House passed the legislation in February. National banks organized under the Act were required to purchase government bonds as a condition of startup. As soon as those bonds were deposited with the federal government, the bank could issue its own notes up to 90% of the market value of the bonds on deposit. The National Bank Act improved but did not solve the nation's financial problems. Some of the 1,500 state banks, which had all been issuing banknotes, were converted to national banks by additional legislation, passed June 1864 to amend the original Bank Act. Other state banks were driven out of business or ceased to issue notes because of the 1865 passage of a 10% federal tax on notes they issued, making it unprofitable for them to print their own money. The legislation created $300 million in national currency in the form of notes issued by the national banks. But since most of this money was distributed in the East, the money supply in other parts of the country remained precarious. The West demanded more money, an issue that would dominate American politics in the years after the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. Nevertheless, the nation's banking system stayed largely the same despite the Panic of 1873 until passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913.
But after nearly 2 decades of accepting the status quo, Friedan asked the question: if women could successfully hold jobs, why shouldn't they?
Assessing their happiness, many women opted to pursue work outside the home. The modern women's movement had begun. Soon women were organizing to promote social and political reforms to do away with discrimination in the workplace and eliminate barriers to entry in education and politics. Friedan herself helped found the National Organization for Women, NOW, in 1966. The association grew rapidly and continues to fight for women's equality in the 21st century.
Who was Alexis de Tocqueville?
Aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville, 1805 to 1859, was only 26 years old when he traveled to New York with his colleague and friend Gustave de Beaumont, 1802 to 1866, to study and observe American democracy. Though Tocqueville set out with the pretext of studying the American penal system on behalf of the French government. Both he and Beaumont were magistrates at the time. He had the deliberate and personal goal of conducting an on-site investigation of the world's first and then only completely democratic society, the United States. Tocqueville and Beaumont traveled for 9 months through New England, eastern Canada, and numerous American cities, including New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, Ohio, and New Orleans, Louisiana. The pair returned to France in 1832 and the following year published their study on the penitentiary system in the United States and its application in France. Once this official obligation was behind him, Tocqueville left his post as magistrate and moved into a modest Paris apartment. There he devoted 2 years to writing Democracy in America, 1835-1840. The work was soon proclaimed the classic treatment of its subject throughout the Western world and secured Tocqueville's fame as political observer, philosopher, and, later, sociologist. Tocqueville proclaimed that during his travels, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. All classes meet continually and no haughtiness at all results from the differences in social position. Everyone shakes hands. But he also foresaw the possibility that the principles of economic equality could be undermined by the American passion for equality, which not only tends to elevate the humble to the rank of the great, but also impels the weak to attempt to lower the powerful to their own level. While he warned against the possible tyranny of the majority as a hazard of democracy, he also added that law, religion, and the press provide safeguards against democratic despotism.